Good evening and a very warm welcome to you on this very fine spring day. My name is Fen Hampson. I'm Director of CIGI's Global Security Program, and I'm delighted to be here and to be part of what promises to be an important and engaging evening with some of Canada's top journalists on the global refugee crisis. I would say it now quite clearly that we are all witnessing the highest displacements of people on the record. Over 21 million, half of them children, who have fled their homelands in search of safety and a better life. As some of you know, this is also the 6th anniversary of a very bloody conflict in Syria, which passed unnoticed last month. The growing number of stories detail the unspeakable challenges that migrants face around the world in their search for asylum. All of this paints a picture of crisis with no clear end in sight, and one which is lacking a clear set of solutions. It has also become increasingly clearer that the current system in place for responding to mass displacement is not working. More often than not, few states rise to the challenge of providing protection and asylum for refugees, while others close their borders. Furthermore, the states that do often arrive as first responders are the same usual suspects that end up shouldering a disproportionate amount of the burden. CIGI's work on refugees looks to these challenges and underscores that while it's difficult to provide an equitable and predictable set of international responses to the current crisis, it is not and should not be seen as an insurmountable challenge. Part of meeting the complexities of this crisis is partaking in and supporting forums like these, where a diverse group can meet to discuss the issues. Tonight's panel is also about recognizing the invaluable role played by individuals who work to tell the stories of this crisis. It is the work of journalists that give us eyes into a world that few can understand, and to get governments and international organizations to pay closer attention. So thank you, panelists, for taking part in this event. And please join me in a warm round of applause before we get started for our friends in the journalistic community. As part of tonight's event, I'm honored to be joined by one of Canada's leading voices on global migration and refugee protection, the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy. After a 20-year, highly distinguished political career, where he served as Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Employment and Immigration, among other postings, he has continued to do a great deal of work on human security, refugee protection, and human rights. Lloyd is in the final stages of contributing to a project within Germany's Robert Bosch Academy's Richard von Weizsäcker Fellowship, and he has been working and looking at ways to shape effective policies around migrants and refugees. Beyond this, he has served as President and Vice Chancellor, as many of you know, at the University of Winnipeg, and also is currently Chancellor at St. Paul's University College. Lloyd, would you like to say a few words?
Well, good evening, everybody, and great to see some, I was going to say old faces, but that's not exactly the way I want to do the interpretation. and also to thank Fen for asking me to say a few words. He was also kind enough to leave me a briefing note. I haven't had those for years now, so I'm kind of on my own, and you know, that could lead in a lot of very strange places. The comment I want to make first is that, as Fen mentioned, I spent 4 years as an immigration minister in the Chrétien government. Margaret, you know, that's when I met your mother. Well, purely a political professional way. At that time, you know, it was demanding. You know, people today, as you know from your own coverage, are kind of, there's lots of angst and sense of anxiety about it all, but at that point in time, we coped with the movement of close to over 700,000 boat people from the Indochina Peninsula. Canada itself took over 100,000 refugees at that period of time. And I guess the point I just simply wanted to make, it was very much based on a very collaborative international cooperative approach. There was about 12 different countries we would meet regularly during that period to share allocations, resources, money, ideas, and particularly how we would be able to work together to see how we could deal with the what are considered the more local issues of settlement and education, and how people really adjust in what's one of the great traumas of life, of moving your family from a conflict or a starvation situation and learning a new language. My wife these days is teaching a group of Yazidis. She's an ELA teacher, and she's doing language training for Yazidis, and it's fascinating to watch how step by step, week by week, she just sees an improvement. I mean, it's remarkable, the human capacity that we have for learning and being able to adjust. But on the other side, I guess what I really wanted to say is that in my last year spending time in Germany, arriving just at the time, shortly after the great surge of refugees were accepted by Chancellor Merkel, and being asked to actually visit various parts of the country for several months and talk about not just the broad issues, but also people who are interested and curious about how Canada responded. What was, I guess, the most cold showering effect was just to realize that how much awful, bad information was being out there that people were being shoveled with by various political sort of opportunists to promote a sort of an anti-immigration agenda. And as this big, great country of Germany, with democratic and all its efforts, we're finding it had to compete with many of its conventional wisdoms. Information was the most important thing that was in discussion. Sharing it, discussing it, and the opportunities for civil societies there, many of whom were from the youth organizations. The one I thought constructive movement was when a group of young people from the different political parties, you know, the youth wings, which are usually the BMOCs, actually came together in a group in Munich to establish a joint effort to have a common position of the political parties in Germany in terms of making the German Constitution apply to this incredible surge of close to 1 million people. It can be done, and I think that I really wanted to say that without making too hard a case, because you'll have a chance to do it, this idea of overcoming the false, the so-called false news that's out there is really one of the most important elements we face, because it is corrupting and destructive of abilities to really handle, as Fen said, one of the really classic and big issues of this generation. So I just wanted to come here and wish you all really well, because we certainly need your involvement and your judgment and your professionalism. So I look forward very much to hearing the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. You did that without a note. It's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel, Susan Harada. Susan is the Associate Director of the School of Journalism at Carleton University. She's also an Associate Professor in the school. She, as many of you know, had a very distinguished career in the field of journalism for over 2 decades. She was with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and her final post was as parliamentary correspondent for the CBC here in Ottawa. Susan.
Thank you. Let me echo Lloyd and Finn when I say that journalism is a crucial part of our democracy, and this becomes most clear at times when the truth is under siege, as it is in some quarters today. And in these times, we need quality journalism and journalists more than ever. Journalists like the 5 that you'll hear from tonight, we need them to sift through the enormous amounts of information that's out there, to verify. We need them to be our eyes and ears on the ground, to bear witness, to add their knowledge and insights to the mix of the information you're hearing. And that's why panels like this one tonight is crucial. At a time when journalists are really just a Facebook Live clip or a tweet away, it's also important for members of the public like you to be able to connect directly with them the way you're doing so tonight, to meet these people because they're out there doing their bit to help us all make sense of the world. Now, Carleton University's journalism program is very proud to collaborate with the Centre for International Governance Innovation on tonight's event. We have a stellar panel, as Fen mentioned, excellent journalists all, and some, I have to say, with deeper Carleton connections. We have Mark McKinnon, who graduated from our program in 1997. We have Michael Petru, who is the recipient of this year's R. James Travers Foreign Corresponding Fellowship, and that's an award administered by the school. And we have Jennifer Ditchburn, who has a Master of Journalism degree from our school. Now, Jennifer is actually the moderator of the panel tonight, not me. I get to sit back and listen. Jennifer is currently the editor-in-chief of Policy Options, which is the online magazine for the Institute of Research and Public Policy. You will know her also from her previous incarnation. She was a journalist with the Canadian Press and with CBC Television and spent more than 2 decades covering national and parliamentary affairs. She has won 3 national newspaper awards and has been honored with the prestigious Charles Lynch Award for outstanding coverage of national issues. So please welcome Jennifer, and she will start our panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan, and thank you to CIGI for having me. I have to admit I feel humble being on the stage with this group. I did a little bit of reporting on the Syrian refugee movement during the 2015 federal election. I have the great privilege of editing some great pieces in Policy Options, including one coming out tomorrow on immigration policy. But these people here are in the field. They're talking to refugees and sharing their stories. They're talking to the people who work with refugees. And I'm quite looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Now, you saw some of the numbers up on the screen before about just the size of the number of people who are displaced right now. The UNHCR estimates it's about 65.3 million people. And of that amount, about 21.3 million are refugees that come from 50% of which come from 3 countries, so Somalia, Afghanistan, and of course, Syria. Canada has taken in, since 2015, just over 40,000 refugees from Syria since 2015, Compare that to Turkey, that has about 3 million registered refugees within its borders. So now when you think about those numbers, you think about the number 65 million displaced people, it's hard to wrap your head around that. It's really hard to conceptualize that. And that's why we have reporters. Reporters help us wrap our minds around those figures by telling us stories about individual people, about an individual family. Sometimes they interview a world leader. Sometimes they go back to the same story over and over and over again to tell us how it's evolved, to give us a better insight into what this problem is really all about. So I'm very glad to be up here. I'm going to ask each one of you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get right into the discussion. And just so you all know how the structure of the evening will go, we're going to have a bit of a conversation here, and then we'll have a portion of the evening which will be for your questions and for questions from our Facebook Live audience, which is cool because I've never done that before. So Mike, I'm going to start with you, and we'll go all the way to Margaret.
My name is Michael Petru. I've been a journalist for a long time. I just got back from Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. I spent a month there reporting on Syrian refugees that have stayed in the Middle East.
I'm Michelle Shepard. I'm the Toronto Star's national security reporter. Been there for about 20 years, and since 9/11 I've covered issues of terrorism and civil rights. Not refugee issues per se, but a lot of the stories have brought me into that. And when Lloyd was talking about fake news in terms of terrorism and refugee issues, I'm usually trying to correct that as much as I can.
My name is Nahid Mustafa. I'm an independent producer, broadcaster, and writer. I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and looking at the refugee issue over there. And I've done a little bit of work on the Syria side, but looking at refugees in Canada. So I can talk about some of that.
My name is Mark McKinnon. I'm the title they give me is Senior International Correspondent for the Globe and Mail, which actually just means we have fewer bureaus than we used to have. And I fly around a lot. So not by design, but by accident, I've spent a lot of time covering the refugee issue over the last couple of years.
I'm Margaret Evans, correspondent with the CBC. I'm based in London right now. I spent about 7 or 8 years in the Middle East and rubbed some shoulders there with Mark at the time. And before that, I was in Brussels, in Belgium, covering the dreaded EU for a number of years. And I'm really pleased to be here.
Thank you. So I figure since we have a whole stage full of storytellers, that I want them to tell us, just to kick off, tell us some stories. So Margaret, you're up. I want to hear about something in the coverage that stayed with you, or a person that might have stayed with you, something that happened over the years that, that you can share.
You know, that is a hugely difficult question, just because as soon as you ask it, you know, there's sort of a whole raft of images come by, and I was thinking about it earlier, and it's a little bit like standing on the shores of the Greek islands, watching at the height of the 2015 refugee crisis, those boats coming across. Sometimes you'd see a dozen launch and land in an hour, and it was just like coming over you in great waves of humanity. And you know, and it was almost like hand clasps, because they were so determined. They'd you know, they just wanted to get to dry land, first of all, be safe, but so determined to move on. They knew where they were going. They had to walk across the island to Mytilene, get to Athens, and continue on their journey. So I have a lot of images in my mind. I have, you know, the man who had a rope tied around his waist, and at the other end, of course, it was a rope tied around his son. Little babies practically suffocating in these life jackets. You know, sometimes the babies being handed out of those boats were, you know, 3 or 4 weeks old. A mother who was with her daughter, and her mother who said, each day I lose a little bit of self-confidence. So that, you know, they stay with you. But the story I'm going to tell you actually predates that. Just as a reminder that this has been going on for a long time. And that was in 2013 on the Italian island of Lampedusa. I met a young man named Mulugeta from Eritrea, and he was one of the survivors of one of these dreadful boats, overcrowded boats, capsizing, and I met him on the island while he was waiting to see what was going to happen to him, and talked to him about his experiences. And I remember at the time a local fisherman had described the day that that boat had sunk. There were 500 people on it and about 350 drowned. He said that he heard the sound of seagulls, and he said, God, the seagulls are so loud today. But it was actually the cries of human beings in the water. And of course, when he heard that, he, flipped into action and went to try to help. And Mulugeta's experience, of course, for him, landing in Lampedusa was a way station, but he'd come so far already, and he talked about being in the water for 4 hours, and about how difficult it had been for him to survive, in part because he had to push others away from him in order to survive, because very few people knew how to swim. And he talked about how he couldn't sleep because of those images that he had in his mind. And he lost his childhood friend whom he traveled with, a guy named Barakat. And I remember asking him, and this is really the thing that sticks with me the most, is, because they would bury people and they just give them numbers in these coffins because they didn't really know the stories. So many people had nobody to speak to. So I asked Barakat, Mulugeta, what was your friend's coffin number? And immediately he said 84. And I remember thinking how lucky the family of the man in the coffin was, because Mulugeta had survived and he could actually get in touch with the family and tell them what had happened to his son. And so a strange way of using the word luck, but that's really what stuck with me about that story. And at the end of it, the irony was that, of course, it was one of these times where, there was a lot of hand-wringing in the European Union about it, and the Italian government made all of those who died honorary citizens, but at the same time, it was investigating the survivors for illegally entering the country. And so it has a lot of resonance with me, that story.
Thank you. Mark?
I guess for me, the salient trip that sticks out of my mind was actually one I took to Jordan in 2015 when Canada was launching its airlift of the 25,000 Syrians to bring them to Canada. And I took a side trip to the Zaatari refugee camp, which has become quite famous. It's the 4th largest city in Jordan. I think it's population 80,000 people, or, if I'm not incorrect. And I'd been there 2 years before, and on a previous trip in, I had written about something that I came to call the Zaatari generation, this generation of millions of Syrian teenagers that were growing up scattered around the Middle East, and sort of this traumatized and angry, and many of them out of schools. But on this first trip in, I had met 2 characters that stuck with me. One was a 14-year-old boy named Halim, and the other was a 15-year-old girl named Anwar. And Halim was actually someone that was chosen for me by the psychologists in the camp. And they'd said that he was the most equipped, the most ready to talk about what had happened to him and to relate the experience to a foreign reporter. So I sat down with Halim, and he started just absolutely robotically telling me about being whipped with cables by Bashar Assad's sort of security forces. And as I'm sitting there listening to this kid who's so obviously still very, very damaged, and thinking this is the kid who's best off right now, and able to talk about it. And the walls of his classroom were covered with these drawings that his classmates had made. One was of a town that he'd drawn pictures of tanks and aircraft bombing this town. Another one had drawn pictures of people that he obviously knew because they were very carefully illustrated, just sitting in pools of their own blood. And the third picture was just black scribble covering the entire piece of paper. And then Anwar was a 15-year-old who was again chosen for me, but really one of the most impressive 15-year-olds I ever met. And she could speak very nice English, and she had this dream of going to a foreign university. And she was telling me about her fight not to get married off to her cousin, because her family was, like many in refugee situations, extremely poor, and saw a young girl as a financial burden that they were hoping to pass on to another family. But at that moment in 2013, there was actually reasons to hope, because they were both in UNICEF schools, and Halim was getting support from the psychologist that Save the Children was providing. Anwar was getting support in her fight with her parents. The people were telling her parents about the great potential their daughter had. And so I went back in 2015 during this airlift, because, and as an aside, very few of the refugees that went to Canada were from Zatari camp, because our own methodology, or the Canadian government's methodology for choosing who came to Canada, tended to focus on people in even more dire situations, people who were not in the camps. But I found Halim, and he was out of school and picking olives and tomatoes, sorry, I live in England, for $1 a day. And when I asked about Anwar, all people knew is that she was married to her cousin and somewhere in Syria. And so not just the hopelessness of their situation, but it was one of those moments where I just felt like, is anyone even reading this stuff? Because all of us, I think, on the stage enter this hoping that we're having some impact, and opening minds and changing hearts a little bit. And it was just one of those moments that, I don't know, it's not the scariest moment or the saddest moment, just one that really stuck with me.
I guess for me, it's similar in that there are so many stories and there are so many people that you meet along the way, and it's difficult to kind of say, well, this story was worse than that story, or more resonant. But I think for me, it's not so much a specific story as it is sort of coming to a realization about how big the problem is. So my family background, we're originally from Pakistan, and so the Afghan presence, the refugee presence in Pakistan, is 3 decades old. I mean, it's been going on for a very long time, and in some ways that scenario is actually instructive for a lot of countries, like what happens when there's a refugee population that's there for a really long time. But when I first started reporting from Afghanistan, one of the things that became very clear to me very quickly was how ubiquitous the refugee experience is in that country. I think, living in Canada or being in a lot of other countries, you may sometimes come across someone who has a refugee background, and it's always a point of interest, or it's always something that comes up as an astonishing aspect of this person's background. But over there, it's incredibly common. Everybody has a refugee story. Every single person that I met in certain parts of Afghanistan, they all have a refugee story. And for some, it may have been a year or two. For some, it may have been decades. And it's one of those things that sort of, it's kind of like you find something out bit by bit, and then suddenly you know all of this stuff. And that was one of the things that I sort of went through, where suddenly I realized this is a population that has had really had its entire history taken apart by this experience of displacement. And how do people deal with that? And you can see, the wealthier people went to Europe, and then the next wealthy may have gone to sort of, local countries in the region, and the poorest of the poor basically poured over the border into Pakistan and lived in camps that eventually became permanent settlements. And you can still see these settlements when you go to Pakistan, and they've taken on their own names and they've taken on their own infrastructure. The way you referred to Zatari as being a town, a lot of these places have this kind of infrastructure. And you don't really realize how generalized that experience is until you go to a place where there has been that kind of mass displacement. So for me, yes, there are specific stories and there are particular images, but I think that for me has been the instructive part of this, is to realize how broad that experience is in certain places where everybody has a refugee story.
Thank you. Michelle?
My story is kind of specific and picks up, or it is very specific, picks up on what Mark said about sometimes it can be quite overwhelmingly depressing when you write these stories, you meet these people, and then you just, especially nowadays, it's really hard to compete for attention or to get anybody to care about it. And I had one of those instances when I was reporting in Mogadishu back in 2010, and I wasn't doing a refugee story. At that time, I was actually covering Al-Shabaab, which was the East African Al-Qaeda group there. And a friend of mine from Toronto who was there, because pretty much anybody in Somalia these days has a Canadian citizenship, which has always made it one of my favorite countries to cover for that reason. It's the only place where the Toronto Star is better than the New York Times or CNN. Like, people come to meet you. And a friend had introduced me to this 17-year-old who had, the Shabab had come and asked him to join. And so many of their members, they just got that way, you know, basically kidnapped these kids. And he had said no. And so the leader said, okay, no problem. And then they came back the next day and they kidnapped him, took him to a stadium, cut off his foot and cut off his hand. One each, and he was devastating. And you know, I remember meeting him, and it was at that time you had a curfew, so you were at the African Union, and they were shouting at me, and here you are in this flak jacket and helmet, and here he is in, you know, flip flops and a sarong, and he was begging me to take him to Canada. And I remember, you know, the soldiers are yelling, and I'm tearing up, taking this picture of him. And they're like, come on, come on, we gotta go. And as I left, I gave him, he looked down in my bag and there was this little Canadian pin, and I gave it to him. And I ran out and I looked back and he dropped it and he was down trying to pick it up. And I went back to Nairobi and just being absolutely devastated and wrote this story about Ismail and but had that feeling that like, nobody's gonna care, nobody's gonna care. So this is one rare case where actually people did care. People here in Canada cared, and they started something called Project Ismail, and they raised money. And a friend of mine who was a Somali-born Canadian photographer who had survived a bombing attack and kind of left journalism. I remember he read it and he called me, and I'll never forget what he said. His name's Sahal Abdul, and he said, you know, I can't save Somalia, but I think I can save Ismail. And he started this incredible project where he's basically snuck him out, got him out in this crazy journey through a bunch of countries. And I went back to Nairobi as he came across, and you know, Ismail and Sahal were reunited, and it was amazing, and he was gonna get him accepted somewhere as a refugee. And I was really banking on Canada. Came back to Toronto, and a few months later, we thought it would be a long time, got a call, and I remember he said, okay, so we've got Ismail placement somewhere. And I was like, Canada? He's like, are you sitting down? Yes. He said, no, it's Norway. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. And he said, it's Harstad, Norway. And I'm Googling Harstad, Norway. And it's 200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. And this was a kid, when we took him to Nairobi, he had culture shock. Like, we went up and down the escalators because he couldn't believe stoplights. I mean, he was overwhelmed in Nairobi. So flew back, met them in Oslo, and the three of us went up to Harstad. And I mean, this story has such a happy ending. Sorry, we'll just wrap this up quickly, but the one part I remember about the flight best is, you know, he's tracing on the map, trying to find how north we are going, and we tell him it's January too. So there's only like 2 hours of twilight because it's so far north. And we tell him, but in the summer there'll be 24 hours of sunlight. And he looks at us and he says, what happens if Ramadan happens during that time? Like, I'm gonna starve. And anyway, obviously we explained, actually I didn't know the answer, but we found out. It's like, no, they will allow you to break fast. So that was 2011, and his English is excellent today. He speaks Norwegian fluently. He's gotten his high school equivalency. He's working on his university degree, and hopefully will get his citizenship this year. Norway at the time when he went there had the most incredibly generous and lovely refugee program. Unfortunately, you know, I think the political climate's changed a bit since, but it was just such a success story. And yeah, I hope someday he can finally get to Canada and be a part of a panel like this, because he's really, I mean, these are the stories that we hear more often than not with a lot of refugees.
Wow, what a story. Thank you. Mike.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I knew, I think, academically, I knew about the extent of Assad's torture, because a lot of the evidence has been smuggled out, and we have photographic evidence, we have, you know, copious, voluminous proof. But I still wasn't quite prepared to encounter time and time again stories, and often it wouldn't even be the first thing that people would tell you. It would be, you know, hours or days later, you know, they'd maybe show a cell phone photograph of their, you know, their terribly bruised and bloody back, or they'd explain the tortures they'd gone through. That was surprising, that was difficult. But if I was going to cluster stories, I think thematically, it would probably be kids, but more specifically, it would be kids that were maybe from the ages of 8 until just around 12, 13. You know, because you'd run into these kids that are 5 or 6 that have made it to Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan, and you know, when you're that age, you kind of think like they might be okay. You know, if you're a 6-year-old and all of a sudden, you know, you've grown up speaking Arabic, but now you have to learn Turkish, you could assimilate. Things could work out for you. I mean, there's enormous challenges ahead, and the poverty and everything else. But the kids that are maybe like on the verge of adolescence that haven't been to school for 5 or 6 years, it's a lot more difficult to be optimistic about those kids because many of them haven't been in school in a meaningful way. They can't read, and now they're just on that cusp where kind of things are about to get worse. You know, if they're kids, if they're women, if they're young girls, the pressures that Mark mentioned of early marriage are severe. You know, I met a girl that was 14 years old, and early marriage is a problem in Syria to begin with, but it's been exacerbated by this disruption of poverty, of you know, a lot of men that are missing or dead. So it's kind of intensified an existing problem. So you have these girls, again, they're 12, they're 13, and that's what's coming for them. Or if they're a boy, again, if they haven't had that education and they're literate and they're 12, well, they're probably going to be working, and it's really difficult to see light at the end of that tunnel. There are kids that I found in southeastern Turkey, 10-year-old girls working in sewing factories, kind of underground, hidden sewing factories. Another 10-year-old girl that I met harvesting potatoes in Lebanon, and really what is essentially indentured labor. A lot of these families owe an awful lot of money to the boss of these kind of informal tent settlements that they live in, who has paid for them, who's paid smugglers, who has brought them from Syria to Lebanon. And now to pay back their debt, he hires them out to local landowners. And these are debts that will never really be paid back, but the mother, the family is forced to try, and they do that by hiring out their kids. So it's those kids that I think are just kind of on the cusp of adolescence, and they might still have the optimism, some of them it's drained out, but they might still have a spark, a little bit of hope, but in the back of your mind, you have that feeling that things are not going to get brighter for them. And there were a lot of kids like that, with, again, the early marriage, the labor, that whole kind of cluster around, in all 3 countries, different dynamics, but this sort of lost childhood and an adolescence and an adulthood that looks bleak.
I can tell from listening to your stories that how much you care about the topic that you've been covering, or the different aspects of it. And I think sometimes when you cover a story closely, then you start to also care about how it's covered more broadly. So Mark, maybe I'll start with you and ask, how do you find that the refugee crisis is portrayed by the bigger media, and does it differ based on where you are? So let's take the UK versus Canada as an example.
Well, I'm not here every day to talk about, or to read and see how it's covered in Canada, so it'd be hard for me to sort of give a really thoughtful answer on that. But in the UK, and I'm actually going to just openly steal from something Margaret said in our preparatory phone call. The media plans things ahead of time. It's a plot. Yeah, and what Margaret's point was that in the UK press, where we both live, it's either there are these angelic characters who are, desperately needing our protection, or there are these scheming migrants who are coming to take our jobs and our social programs and probably our groceries too. And my experience has been that very, very rarely that one of those two sides completely applies. And one of my favorite people that I've met in this entire story is a young Afghan guy named Mikhail, and I met him the same day that Alan Kurdi's body was photographed lying on the beach in Bodrum in Turkey. And like a lot of reporters, I flew there that day and just was walking around the city, and I met this group of Afghans at the main bus station. And while I was talking to them, and Mikhail speaks pretty good English, he was educated as a lawyer in Afghanistan, the Turkish police swooped in and sort of carted away the entire family. anxious to sort of take away the story before the media got there. And so I was mortified that I'd somehow made their life worse, and started writing to Mikhail, found him on social media, and I've written a couple of stories about him since. He's made the classic refugee journey where he risked his life to cross to Greece and then walked along the train tracks up through the Balkans, and eventually made it to Switzerland, where he and his family were separated, and I broke those rules they teach you at Carleton University and actually sort of pulled some strings to get them briefly reunited. Now he's bounced all the way. He got deported after that back to Croatia, and now he's back up in Paris. But the reason why Mikhail was interesting to me in the first place was he was neither a classic, well, he's a refugee from Afghanistan, that he was pulled out of a car by the Taliban. They had a gun put to his head and said, if we see you working for this foreign organization again, which was the Red Crescent, which his father ran in the town, we'll kill you. So he left Afghanistan very understandably. And then he traveled to Turkey, where he was going to study until he found out that the tuition fees were quite high. And then all these people were going to Europe, and he heard Germany had free tuition, and he decided to go along with them. And so you can argue all sides of the coin, but he's actually just somebody who made really understandable decisions in impossible situations. And I think that's what a lot of the refugees are actually like. And Mikhail's line for himself is he calls himself a leaf floating on the river. And I think it's a really sort of apt metaphor for a lot of these people. I mean, he's in Paris now, where right now he has a residency card. He can stay for another year, but Marine Le Pen could be president in a month, and then what happens? So it's all beyond their control. They don't fit either side of this. So yeah, back to your question, I mean, I find the headlines and can often be just, they try and simplify it to grab attention. It's nothing simple about this.
We never do that in the media. Come on. Margaret, is there anything about the coverage that frustrates you?
Well, since Mark has already stolen my answer, no, I think there's just, the thing that I think is startling in the British press, and it's not just this issue, it's much more polarized than what we're used to in Canada. And they're very, very aggressive on the issues that they care about, particularly the tabloid newspapers. And so that, somebody who's out campaigning for, refugee rights, or, yes, we do want you to allow more unaccompanied minors into the country, which has been a big issue in the UK lately. They're not, by the way. But those people are described as mass migration campaigners, and they might not really be in favor of they're not advocating mass migration. They're talking about, civil liberties and civil society and all these kinds of things. It's just that it takes on this kind of pow, pow, and it is very hard left or hard right. And it makes it very, very difficult. And one of the things I find interesting now is that the way in which the media, particularly in the UK, is continuing to operate is as if we are in the midst of 2015. And you want someone to say, hey, didn't you notice, they're still coming across, but they're not coming in these huge numbers, but it's still used by the media, both sides, to kind of hammer home political points. And their pure kind of journalistic reportage gets lost in the kind of the opinion piece battles of the British newspapers. And that's frustrating.
Mike, you just came back from overseas. I'm curious why you chose to go to those three countries, Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon. Was it because you felt maybe there wasn't enough coverage of the refugee issue there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a scale. I mean, to answer your initial question about coverage here, and this isn't just media coverage. I think it's the Canadian public and political class at large. I wish we'd stop being so damn smug about it. I mean, we've accepted 40,000 refugees. I interviewed this guest here, the second part of your question about why I thought it was important to spend a lot of time in the Middle East. I interviewed the mayor of Kilis in southeastern Turkey. And this is a town that prior to the Syrian civil war had about a population of about 94,000 people. It now hosts 135,000 Syrian refugees. And I was talking to the mayor, and he tells me this joke, and the punchline is, he said, You know, Canada is hosting 40,000 refugees. Congratulations. What hotel are they staying in? You know, and his point is a valid one, and I think that we forget it. Think about the very mundane aspects of hosting that many people. Garbage, sewage, water, then expand that to education a little bit. And then I think you start to have a little bit of an idea of the severity of the impact that this refugee crisis is having on the countries that are actually hosting the most refugees, which are, again, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey. Turkey is a wealthy country with a much larger population than Lebanon and Jordan, but still, as you said in the introduction, 3 million people. Lebanon, about a quarter of the population in Lebanon are now refugees. Imagine if 9 million residents of Canada right now were Syrian refugees that have arrived in the last 5 years. I don't think we'd be so welcoming. So I think it was important to get that perspective, that things are, that we're very sheltered here in Canada, and the 40,000 Syrian refugees that have come, they're a rounding error for Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, and for Germany, for that matter as well. It's not just the the education and the infrastructure. Imagine a country like Lebanon that is a little bit fragile, very fragile, I should say, in terms of sectarian balance. And imagine that being disrupted by an arrival of predominantly Sunni Muslim refugees. Imagine some of the language differences in Turkey, which also makes things difficult. It's not a seamless transition. So I guess I just wanted to confront where I think that the impact of the Syrian refugee is greatest. I think that's in the Middle East, and I think that we're really at the beginning of seeing what those repercussions are. Mark had a great story a couple months ago about the graffiti kids, but one of the things you mentioned in your story is you're talking about events of the last 20 years, whether it's the 9/11 or the invasion of Iraq, that'll have the most repercussions, and your opinion was that the Syrian civil war and the resulting displacement are probably one of the most consequential, and I think you're right, and I don't think we've seen those consequences yet, and I think when those consequences happen, yes, they'll happen in Europe, as they already are with some of the nativist populist political movements, but the real impact is going to happen in the Middle East, I think.
Nahid, we've talked a lot about the Syrian refugee movement. How do you think that the movement of Afghan refugees has been covered? I guess that's an area more in your area of expertise.
Well, I think part of, so the Afghan part of this, the Afghan piece of this has really been sort of subsumed in the whole coverage around the refugee crisis in its modern context. I mean, that story's been going on for a long time. One of the ways that this whole, and it sort of goes to the comments that everyone else has already made, that the crisis is often covered through this lens of something that's happening to us, right? The refugee crisis is something that's happening to Europe, it's something that's happening to America, to Canada less so, but there is that, seniors aren't getting their pensions because Syrian refugees are eating it all up. I mean, it's this idea that this crisis is about us and it's not about them. Whereas when you look at the local countries, that's where this crisis is playing out in the worst ways. But one of the things that I think is instructive about the Afghan situation, so for example, if you're looking at the long term, you have a climate in which the political rhetoric and a lot of the media rhetoric is really around, an us and them type of thing. Well, what does this mean now for large populations that are displaced over the long term? What is that going to mean for issues like assimilation, for citizenship, forget citizenship, even residency, for education? How do you then deal with a population in the millions that in 2 generations, 3 generations, we've seen a similar thing with Palestinians, for example. How do you talk about what the place of these people is in this society? I think that a lot of those issues have been taken up with the Afghan crisis. Because if you look at, for example, in Pakistan, there was a very determined effort on a policy level not to extend citizenship to to the children of Afghan refugees, even if they were born in Pakistan. Whereas Pakistan is a country where you do get citizenship on birth. So if you're born there, you get to be a citizen, but that was not something that was extended to the Afghan population. Now you're seeing a repatriation in the hundreds of thousands, and even the UN is saying they can't keep up, but what are they going back to? A lot of people are not going back to something that is stable and that they can actually live with. You extend that out to, for example, countries like Canada, which consider Afghanistan now a safe country. That is a policy problem, because you can't, as a country that's invested, what is the number even? I don't think we even had a number, 18 billion, 20 billion that this country put into the war, in its war effort in Afghanistan. Can you now say, well, that money was wasted, it's not a safe country? What can you own up to? What can you own? And so these are a lot of the questions, I think, that come out of what we've seen with Afghanistan and what we've seen with the refugee crisis there, which I think will be instructive for how the mass, the mass displacement of Syrians is. What is the conversation that Turkey is having about belonging? Is there an idea that this population is going to go back? Go back to what? I don't think that we've even started to touch on any of those things, and I don't think there's been any kind of real reckoning. Of course, understanding that that's a situation that's still very much in flux, it's very new, it hasn't been settled. But if you look at the Afghan situation, that's been going on for 30 years, and those questions are still around.
And we barely talk about it.
We barely talk about it. I mean, if you just look at Canadian coverage, Afghanistan's done, wrapped up in a bow, and it's on its way. But civilian casualties and civilian deaths increase year on year. Every year, it is the worst year for civilian casualties, in war. I mean, we're not talking about disease and maternal mortality. We're talking about dying violent deaths in conflict. That number keeps going up in Afghanistan, and yet we don't want to take refugees from there because it's a safe country. So I think there's a lot to really think about and talk about as we move forward on this.
Obviously, we can't talk about issues around refugees and immigration without talking about politics. Came up in our own election in 2015. It was one of the major campaign issues that Donald Trump campaigned on. Michelle, you've done some reporting. You mentioned on the Somali movement of refugees. You've been in the big Dadaab refugee camp. How do you find that the refugee issue is portrayed as a security issue by politicians?
Yeah, I think this is probably where most of my coverage has been, because it's the sort of classic terrorism fear factor that is used. And, two things really, well, a lot of things drive me crazy. Two things in particular drive me crazy about that, and the way that it's covered, partly the way it's covered, but also the way that, politicians, frankly, use it to support their own agendas. It's just not based on fact. I mean, that sounds so cliche today because we say it all the time. But people really don't seem to push back on this when it's used as, the immigration or the refugee boogeyman being responsible for terrorism. And you mentioned Dadaab, that's the massive refugee camp in Kenya on the border of Somalia. Certainly that happens there every time there is an issue with a Shabab attack, and the Kenyan government threatens to close Dadaab. And it's never been anybody from Dadaab, but that idea of Somalis in our midst is enough to sort of start the political machine going. And certainly, of course, we've seen this in the United States with some of the policies that have come in. And I did actually write a couple stats down because I wanted to look up to see, how many cases there actually had been. And the numbers are kind of startling. So in the US, the New American Foundation did a study, and they found that every lethal attack post 9/11 was either a citizen or a legal resident. The Cato study looked at the past 41 years of terrorism incidents. And in the US, they found that you had, as an American citizen, a 1 in 3.6 million chance of being killed by a foreigner, one citizen in 1.36 billion by a refugee, and illegal immigrants, 1 in 10.9 billion. So I mean, those numbers are startling. I think that's obviously, one huge issue. The other issue, and this is kind of a bit of a tangent, but something that drives me crazy in terms of this coverage, is a lot of what I've done over the years is looked at sort of terrorist propaganda and terrorist messaging. And right now in particular, I mean, ISIS has been one of the most skilled groups to use politics to further their agenda. So when we talk about security issues, things like the ban on Muslim majority countries, if anything, in terms of the propaganda machine, it doesn't make us any more secure. If anything, it just makes us more insecure because of the gift that gives the propagandists.
It's interesting because the Trump executive orders around immigration all seem to be underpinned by the idea that refugees are going to hurt you in some way, or immigrants are going to hurt you, or they're a threat to your security. On that note, Mark, I think the Hungarian president this week called refugees the Trojan horse. I'm interested to find out how you see politics in Europe around refugees. What's the latest discourse? How do you see things going?
I think Hungary is obviously, the last time I spoke with the spokesperson for Viktor Orban, he was saying, look, we've been proven right. Look, Donald Trump's been elected. We were right all along. So this sort of factless tunnel tends to blow itself along. That was a terrible metaphor. But there is this lurch to the right, this anti-immigrant sentiment. There is a legitimacy to it. Last year I was in, maybe legitimacy is the wrong word, but like you can empathize with these people. To get to the point that Michael made earlier, I was in southern Austria on the Slovenian border in a town where everybody was voting for Norbert Hofer, this candidate from the far-right Freedom Party. And I was asking people, like why, after all these years of trying to, voting for other parties, why at this moment are you willing to vote for this party that people call neo-Nazi? And every single one of them told the same story of the day that tens of thousands of people walked through this little town from the sound of music while police helicopters swirled overhead shouting directions in Arabic. And they were in their homes and they were absolutely terrified. And like Michael suggested, I mean, I come from Stittsville, Ontario, which had 10,000 people in it when I grew up. And I can't imagine the reaction there. I'm not sure Canadians would react any differently. I hope we would react differently, but I certainly can't be sure of it. But there's also this sort of very deliberate attempt by certain politicians, and I'll go even further and say certain countries, to try and use this to exaggerate, to in some cases fabricate the involvement of refugees and migrants in security incidents. And I think something I can't avoid saying at this moment is that the Russian government and websites that are affiliated with them have definitely pushed this agenda forward and made it clear that it's part of their effort to undermine Europeans' trust in their government, because that suits a completely separate agenda over sanctions in Ukraine. But there are many forces took a legitimate sentiment and pushed it in somewhere very dangerous and not based in fact.
Thank you. Now, I have pages and pages of questions, but I think we need to take some from our audience and from Facebook too.
We drew one really interesting one from Facebook, and the question was, how would you describe the moral problems reporters face when covering refugees? Do you ever feel guilty that you get to go back home?
Always?
Always, yeah. Always. I mean, but it is interesting that there is that sort of line that, when I told the story of Isma, I became incredibly involved in that. I mean, I still go back and see him when I can. And it gets tougher and tougher when you're out there and you try and always keep sort of a journalistic distance, excuse me. And I find that the more years I cover this, the harder that gets. And I think probably every journalist, correct me if I'm wrong, but has had that feeling when you're out there where you just want to, when you don't feel like your stories are doing anything, you just want to kind of give it up and, join an NGO and get your hands dirty and just actually try and help, one person, because the magnitude of it seems so great.
I had an experience in Lesbos once where I almost got involved, but didn't, and it was just because it was at the time, if islanders were forbidden, they couldn't give rides to people. They would be fined if they picked up refugees walking from the side of the island. They landed to Mytilene, which is where they had to go if they wanted to catch a ferry, and hotels were not allowed to give them rooms, and in the lobby of my hotel, and I mean this was at the time where, I mean, it was everywhere you looked, there were just people sleeping rough on the streets, whole families, and it became a big problem for people because they were being denied access to places where they could shower, and they weren't being given papers so they could get off the island, and there were no facilities whatsoever. And a man came into the lobby of our hotel, and he had his 2 kids with him, and he was asking, he said, I have money, and I'm just asking, could we just rent a room for a few hours, just, so my kids can have a shower and we can get some sleep. And even though there were plenty of rooms in the hotel, they were turned away. And the look of defeat and shame on his face in front of his kids is something I've just, I still with me today. And I wanted to just scream at the receptionist. But of course, that was the law of the island at the time. But I don't know, there are a million stories like that.
And I'll encourage you to come up to the mics to ask questions if you have any. While you're coming up, Mike, maybe you can just return to the issue of politics. What are you hearing in terms of the political discourse in the Middle East right now around refugees?
I mean, look, certainly regarding what Canada is doing, I mean, yes, it's noticed. Yes, there is, the mayor's not the only one to point out that what we're taking is small, but I mean, the Prime Minister's gesture has been noticed and is appreciated. I think I heard that widely. I think what a lot of Syrians are saying, and what I'd echo, which I think is an enormous kind of black hole in terms of political attention here, though, is the driving cause of the refugee crisis is Bashar al-Assad. That is who the vast majority of Syrians have fled. That is who it's his regime that is responsible for the vast majority of deaths. And no one, it's completely ignored by Canadian politicians. Donald Trump has appeared to have accepted the status quo. So in terms of the root causes of the refugee crisis, I mean, sure, we can take another 10,000, we can take another 20,000, we can give another 100 million to this NGO or that NGO or bilateral aid, but the main reason why there are 11, 12 million displaced Syrians is because Damascus is controlled by a guy that has used poison gas on children. And no Western politician really wants to confront or deal with that. And that absence, I think, is, as much as Syrians, I think, notice and appreciate some of the gestures of solidarity and kindness that have come out of Canada and out of other countries in the West, I think that absence is noticed as well.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you very much for being here and answering our questions. A few of you touched on the issue of how do you make Canadians care, your readers, your viewers care, and no one really seemed to have an answer, but at the same time, you've all made careers of it. So I'm curious what each of you individually do to make Canadians at home care about these issues.
It was, I think it was you that had said one time that you can do a story on a cat stuck in a tree and people will just go insane, and you can do a story about dead children and you won't even get like one response. And I think that's very much true. I don't know, like for me, I can't worry about that piece, that is someone going to care if they read the story, or if they hear the story, or if they see the story. I have to do I have to do the story. I have to do the best job I can do and hope that, you know, whoever reads it, it resonates with them and they get something from it. I don't know if there is anything you can do. I think people get tired. I think that they get numb to it after a while. I think that when news is overwhelming, you hear it all the time. I hear it all the time. People say, well, I'm just going to check out now because it's just overwhelming and I'm not going to read anything anymore. Which is fair, I guess. So I don't know. I mean, obviously everyone else sort of has their own thing, but that's sort of my thing. I can't worry about that because you can't force people to care.
I think people are just overwhelmed. As you said, I mean, we get overwhelmed, so obviously, I mean, everybody is like that. And I think this is sort of basic storytelling 101, but I think it comes down to trying to make people relate to that one person, that one story. I mean, that's why Alan Kurdi's Body had such an incredible impact, because everyone's like, oh, that could be my child, that is a child. I mean, so I think that's what it takes, trying to find that one story that's going to resonate with somebody, that's going to cross boundaries, that's not going to overwhelm you, and then make that one story tell a greater truth. But I do find it is harder and harder to, I mean, in the last 2 or 3 years, it's just getting more difficult because of social media and a whole variety of factors. But it's really hard to get people's attention and then to keep it.
That was actually the genesis of a piece that Michael mentioned earlier, where the Globe and Mail has not done a stellar job of covering the Syrian conflict, I would argue, and I don't think my editors will be happy, but I don't think they'd argue with me on that point, because we don't have a Middle East bureau anymore. It's one of the cuts we've had to make. So my editors asked me, so let's try and tell one story that will get us from the start of this to now, explain what happened and how we got to here for everybody who wasn't paying attention until this moment. And that's what we set out to do. That said, I mean, I looked at the statistics, and the top 2 stories I've ever written remain a piece about my cat and one about the world's oldest porn star. So you can't win them all.
Thank you. I'm going to go to you because she was here first, so yes.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to take advantage of having a panel of such seasoned reporters. I'm an aid worker with Oxfam, and I was interviewed last week on The National regarding the food crises facing many countries in Africa, including South Sudan, a country that's been in conflict for a long time, and a driver of many refugees to Uganda and neighboring countries. And the question that I was posed is, why do you think this conflict and these food crises are very underreported, and it's very difficult to get media attention on this at the moment? And I'd like to pose that question to the panel, because even tonight we focused a lot on the Syrian refugee crisis and more Middle East with touching Afghanistan and Somalia, but there's so many other crises, and I'm wondering why you think this particular one is really struggling to get media attention, even though it's facing possibly 20 million people that might starve.
It's because the victims are Black and African. I mean, I could elaborate on that, but and it's not pure cynicism. I mean, it's more expensive for journalists to get there. There isn't the same sort of diaspora resonance in Canada. But all our news organizations have done a terrible job of covering conflicts in Africa. I'm sure we've all had experiences of trying to maybe pitch stories about what's happening in Africa, of writing them and not having them resonate. And part of it is also the cynical quip I made at the beginning. It's because the victims are Black and African. I remember spending a year researching an alleged war criminal, and who was living in Toronto. He was Liberian, former Liberian warlord. Gathered enormous amounts of evidence about the crimes he had allegedly committed, nailed the story down, published it. Nobody cared. His victims were Black and African. I think if the same alleged crimes that happened in Europe, even on the outskirts of Europe and in the Balkans, it would have been different. So maybe the other panelists have a more hopeful answer, but I'm sorry. I think that's part of it.
I think there's also a perception that it's a perennial story, right? And so there's this sense that, well, Yeah, but it happens all the time. And that's not to say that that's a legitimate thing to say, but I think it's, part of it is, I think there are certain stories that are hard, and I'm also saying this as a producer, because I also work as a show producer, and I know that when we sit down in our pitch meetings and we try to put stories together, if there's a perception that the story is too complicated, there's too much of a backstory, and I think a lot of stories from African countries, that's the perception, it's a complicated story. I think it's partly what Michael just said about the victims in this story are black. And I think there's a sentiment that these are perennial stories, and so it's not as important because we're going to be here again next year. And it's difficult to get those stories to go forward. I find that there are a couple of things, like even when the Arab Spring started, as an example, it's not exactly the same thing, but I pitched stuff for months before it got a yes from the desk. And it wasn't really until you started seeing agitations in Egypt that the media started picking up on it, and part of it had to do with access. It had to do with lots of English speakers in Egypt who could talk, who were good talkers, who could come on, your show and explain their way. They were well connected through social media, and so it was, in that sense, a little easier to do that story. So I think it's a bunch of different things, but I have generally found in the 20 plus years I've been doing this work, I have generally found it's really hard to get stories from Africa move forward.
I'm all good points, but I'm going to give the more hopeful or optimistic answer, which is, we last year went to Ethiopia to cover the famine there, and did some context pieces about how it differed from the one we all remember from the Band-Aid song. And we are going to South Sudan in the next 2 weeks, and so we're, but it takes a greater logistical effort sometimes, depending on where you're going, and partly because, what Mark was alluding to earlier, that so many Canadian news organizations are faced with bureau cuts. The imprint, the size of the world that you cover is so much bigger. And and some of the countries that you're going to and trying to get to, there's a lot of red tape involved. You have to deal with the insurance issues, which makes it more expensive. It's not a justification, but it's an explanation, if you like, that it can sometimes just be a lot harder. You're going to cover vast sort of swaths of territory. You've got to move. It means you've got to have enough food and water for your crew and all of your gear, and you have to wait to get on UN flights because, a lot of the time you don't want to necessarily take the local airline. It's just more complicated in some countries, but I don't think that in the news industry, in particular, the desire to cover those stories is quite as negative.
We could have a whole conversation about the impact of analytics on coverage,
Yes.
which is relatively new. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In a similar way, I want to take advantage of the expertise that's on the stage to ask a question, Mark, that builds from your observation in the UK that there are sort of two archetypes that are used in the media: the sort of the tabloid, they're coming to grab our jobs, versus the the Guardian Independent, they're to be saved. And it's a similar challenge that I face, and I think many of us face here in Canada. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton, and a year ago, November, when the resettlement plan was announced, I gave about 30 interviews, and it was very easy to give the interviews to some of your news outlets because there was a genuine curiosity and a desire to understand the process, the criteria. The hardest interviews were with AM talk radio. And so the question that I have for you is that there are news outlets where we shouldn't be so smug in Canada that there are dissenting voices within Canada, and voices and media outlets that aren't necessarily interested in the complexity and the detail of explaining it's not a refugee crisis, it's the crisis of the refugee regime, and let me tell you what happened in 1950 and 1979, you've lost them. So give us some advice in terms of how can we take these complex issues that we've been talking about, how can we communicate those in a way to a more dissenting media voices in Canada?
I got the tough question.
It's a good question.
It's a very good question, and I will admit to some trepidation going on. There are often some of the AM radio stations you mentioned, they don't have their own correspondents abroad, and they often borrow from those organizations that do. They'll call you up and ask you to sort of narrate what just happened in Moscow or whatever. And you do find yourself sort of changing what you say because you're aware of the audience, not trying to simplify it or change the message. Well, yes, you are trying to simplify it. You're not trying to change the message, but trying to sort of, again, just find a relatable characters and don't make it about all the Syrians. Make it about the Ishmael or the character that everyone can understand. And because we cannot, as I said, I can't speak for all of the refugees and I can't vouch for all of them, but I can tell you the stories of the ones I've met, and I hope they're compelling, and that's all you can do in the 30 seconds they allot you.
I'm Michelle, and then I'm going to take one more question, and then you're going to go off to the nice reception. Well,
I'm not sure if everyone here would agree with this, but I think especially on the print side, we have to face reality of what's happening to our industry and our declining revenues and what journalism is going to look like. And I think it is time to start exploring some types of partnerships. So I know in my field, a lot of the work I was doing with, say, the issue of the foreign fighters, I mean, some of the best work that was being done were academics, because a lot of, whereas, when we used to cover terrorism, we would go to these places and for some reason, some of people on UN terrorism watch lists would agree to speak with journalists, and we would be in field. But so much of it now is online, and a lot of the academics were the ones who had the time or the grants to sort of sift through that, and yet they would produce these obtuse, no offense, obtuse reports that, my father was a professor, so I feel I'm allowed to say this, that frankly none of us read. I mean, we try to. If you have a beat, then often
you have to read policy options, because we translate it. Anyway, go.
CIGI policy briefs, but that's okay.
So I think there has to be a better way that, you can not just look at, I just read your executive brief, I need one quote type of scenario that we have had for a long time, and find some way to partner so that you can work together in some fashion, whether it's having academics publish more than just op-eds or partnering with a journalist. I think we have to look towards that.
Can I add to that real quick? So last summer I did do something very similar to what Michelle is talking about. I was part of a project that did a big rollout on Syrian refugees in Canada. And so the portion that I wrote about was how digital tools and digital technology extends conflict and creates vulnerabilities in populations outside of the war zone. And that was for Open Canada. So a little plug for Open Canada. But it was a collaboration between academics and journalists to basically look at one issue area in a way that academics could contribute what they're good at and journalists could contribute what they're good at to come to a more sort of holistic understanding. But in terms of that first question that you were asking about, like how to talk to that audience that's dissenting, one of the things, and I'm not very good at this, and maybe somebody else has more experience with this, is I think that, I know that there's a lot of research out there that shows data doesn't change people's minds. Like if you're committed to something ideologically, you're going to be committed to it. But I think numbers do help in the sense that at least you can hold your own, right? Like at least you can say, actually, the number of refugees that have committed crimes is infinitesimal. I think that we're just going to have to be in that realm where we're all sort of armed with a handful of statistics that we can kind of throw out there to sort of stop some of those narratives in their tracks, at least for 2 minutes until you can catch your breath.
Thank you. And one last question here.
Hi, I just want to say again, thank you so much for continuing to report and to be here for today's event. Specifically with respect to the refugee crisis, beyond like telling compelling stories and reporting on the issue itself, what do you think is the role of journalists in holding organizations that make policy to account? So whether that's the OIC or the League of Arab States or the UN Security Council, and what do you think is the best approach to this from a journalistic perspective?
Well, I don't see you. I guess it's just to keep reporting on it. I mean, there are all sorts of examples. The example at the beginning where you've got the Italian government, declaring the dead honorary citizens and the living criminals, for surviving, basically. I mean, those kinds of things, the European Union, again, we go back to statistics. The last I looked, which would have been just before Christmas, they'd relocated 6,000 people out of a promise of 160,000. And yet, at the same time, the media reflection in the European press is well, we've taken 160,000. What more do they want? So I think it's just to keep peeling back the layers and exposing and not getting fatigued by it and not getting depressed because as everybody said that it can feel a little bit like nobody's listening. But I do think one thing that we haven't really touched on, and that is too, that I don't know that we do the best job that we can in reporting the other side of the argument in a case and trying to delve a little bit deeper into the people who are so determined to reject the facts as we know them in a sense. And again, not a justification, but an explanation. But just there are a lot of topics out there, and our media institutions, organizations, we're all kind of shrinking. So support your.
But on an optimistic note, in all these places that we've been reporting from, I worry what would have gone worse had there not been international journalists that had gone to Turkey, had there not been journalists that had gone to Greece and reported on the conditions there. That does force the government, especially in a place like, let's pick on Hungary for a second, where the media is not completely free. We're the ones bringing the scrutiny as slapdash and haphazard as the scrutiny is. So to reverse my previous negativity. But yeah, and Margaret makes a great point. I should have said this to the earlier answer. If I had 30 seconds on the air, maybe acknowledging the very legitimate concern of the other side will go some distance to making it feel less like we're in an argument and more like, here's some facts that perhaps you should also consider.
I would just add too that the accountability, it's also for our own government and its integration efforts and how much money it's spending. Is it enough? I think, Nahid, you've done some reporting on refugees as they've arrived in Canada, and
yeah. So I mean, I think it's really early still, and I think we haven't really seen, there hasn't been enough time to kind of see what this looks like in the long term. But in terms of what I'm hearing, both from the settlement side, so people working in agencies on the front line, but also from refugees. On the settlement side, there was a real sense that it's very sort of haphazard. There isn't a lot of long-term thinking in terms of, what does this look like? The other part of it, I think, is that often there seems to be this sort of conflation between the immigration piece and the refugee piece. And so immigrants coming to this country are very, very different than the profile of refugees. And a lot of Syrian refugees, for example, a lot of them are rural people, used to farming. They're not used to living in the way that they're being expected to live in sort of the settlement phase. So some of the things that I've been hearing is just not having enough access to orientation. It isn't even the bigger piece about I'm having trouble finding work. It's really about I don't even know how to move around. I don't even know how to take the bus. I don't even know, some of the kids haven't been in school for a long time. And I think that it makes a difference also. I did this whole thing on looking at small communities across the country that had taken in Syrian refugees. And in some communities, it's a very affluent group that's done the sponsorship. It's a smaller community. They've been able to offer up very sort of intense one-on-one guidance. There's loads of people to help. And it's a different story out there, whereas, it's sort of, you'll have both things at the same time. People that have been settled in, say, a place like Toronto, They'll have other kinds of ease in the sense that they have a larger community that they can integrate into. If they're religious people and they end up near a mosque, then that's another thing that's to their advantage. But the settlement issues are the same, you know, and what happens when that 1 year is up? What happens when I'm actually going to have to be on my own because the help is only for 12 months? So what happens when I'm expected to get a job and I haven't found a job because, you know, the kids aren't even settled, so how do I think about having a job? I think a lot of those integration issues, like, they haven't really been thought out, and they're not necessarily much different than the kind of integration issues that a new immigrant might face, but I think the bar is just so much higher because there's so many more obstacles in the way, and they're just dealing with so much more. Set aside even the trauma piece, right? Like people that have been living displaced. You know, what are the kids going through? What is the family going through? There is family breakdown. You know, you're seeing families that are falling apart, couples that are getting into conflict because of all of the trauma coming, you know, and it's coming to the surface now. So I think it's still early days, but yeah, from what, you know, what I'm hearing really is that that integration piece hasn't really been thought out, and people are struggling.
Thank you. Michelle and Mike, any final thoughts?
It's a really uplifting conversation we've had tonight. No, I mean, I'll just echo what Mike said earlier about not being too smug. You know, I'm of course very proud of what Canada has done and the way that we've supported many refugees, but again, when you travel outside of here and you realize the scope of the problem, I think, you know, just as Canadians, we have to do more.
Thank you, and thanks for those great questions. I thought I would just end with this quote from Louise Arbour, who's now the Special Representative to the UN Secretary General for International Migration. She said last week, "Migrants are the bridges between countries of origin, transit, and destination. They are the spark that ignites new ideas and new thinking, fosters innovation, and propels our societies forward rather than backward." Thank you, panelists, and thank you to a great audience.
Good evening and a very warm welcome to you on this very fine spring day. My name is Fenn Hampson. I'm Director of CIGI's Global Security Program, and I'm delighted to be here and to be part of what promises to be an important and engaging evening with some of Canada's top journalists on the global refugee crisis. I would say it now quite clearly that we are all witnessing the highest displacements of people on the record. Over 21 million, half of them children, who have fled their homelands in search of safety and a better life. As some of you know, this is also the 6th anniversary of a very bloody conflict in Syria, which passed unnoticed last month. The growing number of stories detail the unspeakable challenges that migrants face around the world in their search for asylum. All of this paints a picture of crisis with no clear end in sight, and one which is lacking a clear set of solutions. It has also become increasingly clearer that the current system in place for responding to mass displacement is not working. More often than not, few states rise to the challenge of providing protection and asylum for refugees, while others close their borders. Furthermore, the states that do often arrive as first responders are the same usual suspects that end up shouldering a disproportionate amount of the burden. CIGI's work on refugees looks to these challenges and underscores that while it's difficult to provide an equitable and predictable set of international responses to the current crisis, it is not and should not be seen as an insurmountable challenge. Part of meeting the complexities of this crisis is partaking in and supporting forums like these, where a diverse group can meet to discuss the issues. Tonight's panel is also about recognizing the invaluable role played by individuals who work to tell the stories of this crisis. It is the work of journalists that give us eyes into a world that few can understand, and to get governments and international organizations to pay closer attention. So thank you.
I have to say, with deeper Carleton connections, we have Mark McKinnon, who graduated from our program in 1997. We have Michael Petru, who is the recipient of this year's R. James Travers Foreign Corresponding Fellowship, and that's an award administered by the school. And we have Jennifer Ditchburn, who has a Master of Journalism degree from our school. Now, Jennifer is actually the moderator of the panel tonight, not me. I get to sit back and listen. Jennifer is currently the editor-in-chief of Policy Options, which is the online magazine for the Institute of Research and Public Policy. You will know her also from her previous incarnation. She was a journalist with the Canadian Press and with CBC Television and spent more than 2 decades covering national and parliamentary affairs. She has won 3 national newspaper awards and has been honored with the prestigious Charles Lynch Award for outstanding coverage of national issues. So please welcome Jennifer, and she will start our panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan, and thank you to CIGI for having me. I have to admit, I feel humble being on the stage with this group. I did a little bit of reporting on the Syrian refugee movement during the 2015 federal election. I have the great privilege of editing some great pieces in Policy Options, including one coming out tomorrow on immigration policy. But these people here are in the field. They're talking to refugees and sharing their stories. They're talking to the people who work with refugees. And I'm quite looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Now, you saw some of the numbers up on the screen before about just the size of the number of people who are displaced right now. The UNHCR estimates it's about 65.3 million people. And of that amount, about 21.3 million are refugees that come from 50% of which come from 3 countries, so Somalia, Afghanistan, and of course, Syria. Canada has taken in, since 2015, just over 40,000 refugees from Syria since 2015. Compare that to Turkey, that has about 3 million registered refugees within its borders. So now when you think about those numbers, you think about the number 65 million displaced people, it's hard to wrap your head around that. It's really hard to conceptualize that. And that's why we have reporters. Reporters help us wrap our minds around those figures by telling us stories about individual people, about an individual family. Sometimes they interview a world leader. Sometimes they go back to the same story over and over and over again to tell us how it's evolved, to give us a better insight into what this problem is really all about. So I'm very...
Thank you, panelists, for taking part in this event. And please join me in a warm round of applause before we get started for our friends in the journalistic community. As part of tonight's event, I'm honored to be joined by one of Canada's leading voices on global migration and refugee protection, the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy, After a 20-year, highly distinguished political career, where he served as Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Employment and Immigration, among other postings, he has continued to do a great deal of work on human security, refugee protection, and human rights. Lloyd is in the final stages of contributing to a project within Germany's Robert Bosch Academy's Richard von Weizsäcker Fellowship, and he has been working and looking at ways to shape effective policies around migrants and refugees. Beyond this, he has served as President and Vice Chancellor, as many of you know, at the University of Winnipeg, and also is currently Chancellor at St. Paul's University College. Lloyd, would you like to say a few words?
Well, good evening, everybody, and great to see some, I was going to say old faces, but that's not exactly the way I want to do the interpretation. And also to thank Fen for asking me to say a few words. He was also kind enough to leave me a briefing note. I haven't had those for years now, so I'm kind of on my own, and you know, that could lead in a lot of very strange places. The comment I want to make first is that, as Fen mentioned, I spent 4 years as an immigration minister in the Chrétien government. Margaret, you know, that's when I met your mother. Well, purely a political professional way. At that time, you know, it was demanding. You know, people today, as you know from your own coverage, are kind of, there's lots of angst and sense of anxiety about it all, but at that point in time, we coped with the movement of close to over 700,000 boat people from the Indochina Peninsula. Canada itself took over 100,000 refugees at that period of time. And I guess the point I just, without making too hard a case, because you'll have a chance to do it, this idea of overcoming the false, the so-called false news that's out there is really one of the most important elements we face, because it is corrupting and destructive of abilities to really handle, as Fen said, one of the really classic and big issues of this generation. So I just wanted to come here and wish you all really well, because we certainly need your involvement and your judgment and your professionalism. So I look forward very much to hearing the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. You did that without a note. It's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel, Susan Harada. Susan is the Associate Director of the School of Journalism at Carleton University. She's also an Associate Professor in the school. She, as many of you know, had a very distinguished career in the field of journalism for over 2 decades. She was with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and her final post was as parliamentary correspondent for the CBC here in Ottawa. Susan.
Thank you. Let me echo Lloyd and Fen when I say that journalism is a crucial part of our democracy, and this becomes most clear at times when the truth is under siege, as it is in some quarters today. And in these times, we need quality journalism and journalists more than ever. Journalists like the 5 that you'll hear from tonight, we need them to sift through the enormous amounts of information that's out there, to verify, We need them to be our eyes and ears on the ground, to bear witness, to add their knowledge and insights to the mix of the information you're hearing. And that's why panels like this one tonight is crucial. At a time when journalists are really just a Facebook Live clip or a tweet away, it's also important for members of the public like you to be able to connect directly with them the way you're doing so tonight, to meet these people because they're out there doing their bit to help us all make sense of the world. Now, Carleton University's journalism program is very proud to collaborate with the Centre for International Governance Innovation on tonight's event. We have a stellar panel, as Ben mentioned, excellent journalists all, and some...
I simply wanted to make it was very much based on a very collaborative international cooperative approach. There was about 12 different countries we would meet regularly during that period to share allocations, resources, money, ideas, and particularly how we would be able to work together to see how we could deal with what are considered the more local issues of settlement and education and how people really adjust in what's one of the great traumas of life, of moving your family from a conflict or a starvation situation and learning a new language. My wife these days is teaching a group of Yazidis. She's an ELA teacher and she's doing language training for Yazidis, and it's fascinating to watch how step by step, week by week, she just sees an improvement. I mean, it's remarkable the human capacity that we have for learning and being able to adjust. But on the other side, I guess what I really wanted to say is that in my last year spending time in Germany, arriving just at the time, shortly after the great surge of refugees were accepted by Chancellor Merkel, and being asked to actually visit various parts of the country for several months and talk about not just the broad issues, but also people who are interested and curious about how Canada responded. What was, I guess, the most cold showering effect was just to realize that how much awful, bad information was being out there that people were being shoveled with by various political sort of opportunists to promote a sort of an anti-immigration agenda. And as this big, great country of Germany, with democratic and all its efforts, we're finding it had to compete with many of its conventional wisdoms. Information was the most important thing that was in discussion. Sharing it, discussing it, and the opportunities for civil societies there, many of whom were from the youth organizations. The one I thought constructive movement was when a group of young people from the different political parties, the youth wings, which are usually the MOCs, actually came together in a group in Munich to establish a joint effort to have a common position of the political parties in Germany in terms of making the German Constitution apply to this incredible surge of close to 1 million people. It can be done, and I think that I really wanted to say that